there's a deep crisis on the planet. And it's usually difficult to see it because we tend to look at the world from our own lenses, our own culture, our own personal perspectives. It requires us now, at this point in our evolution, to stand back from our particular worldview and begin to take a wider vista of many different alternative religious worlds, spiritual worlds, perspectives. And when you do that, when you get into a more global perspective, a profound pattern begins to emerge that's really startling on the planet, that you can't see when you're looking through a more monocentric lens. And that pattern is that the great spiritual wisdom, the great endowment of all the great spiritual traditions, converge on an insight that humanity is in a painful shift, a difficult shift, a deep shift evolutionarily, from egocentric patterns of processing ourselves world information to a deeper, more integrative and holistic way, a dialogic way of being a human being. And the pattern that's revealed, that is seen by these great spiritual traditions, is that egocentric minding as a pattern, as a technology of making ourselves in our world. We don't usually think of technology in terms of how we use our minds, is the single most disastrous cause of manufacturing the human situation. When you enter the global lens, you begin to see that human beings make our worlds with how we use our minds. It's one of the great insights. For example, in Buddhist insight, the essence of Buddha's awakening is to see that the ego is to suffer. It is a stage of our evolution. And if we get stuck in ego minding, taking ourselves to be a separate existing entity, and seeing the world from that angle of our culture, whatever it may be, our own ethnicity, our own perspective, it leads to fragmentation, polarization, separations, disintegration, and is the source ultimately of the deepest forms of violence of all kinds. If you see that, if you begin to see that how we mind matters, and that ego minding produces and manufactures the disastrous situation we have on the planet, then the prescription that has been seen by our great spiritual teachers is that we don't have to ego mind. We have a choice, and we can shift into a deeper, more integrative way. And that takes us, in fact, into the reality as it really is. Because the insight is that reality is a profound, unified, integrative, dynamic, interactive field. And when our patterns of thinking and minding, processing reality, moves in the law-like way of that unified, integrative field, then we're in touch with reality. And it's there that the moral consciousness, the compassion, the feeling the connections, the discovering in our hearts and our cellular level, the connectivity begins to come clear. Now on the planet, we've reached a threshold where our choice is to awaken to this or perish. Our survival turns on this. A worldview is an ecology of mind that gives us everything about ourselves. I see myself. The lens I see myself through and to my world is the ecology, the shape of my mental space. That is my worldview. My religion, my culture, my ethnicity, and sometimes even my discipline if I'm a scientist or someone in the academy. And we're also seeing the world through that. And what has not been understood is that a worldview as a conceptual space, as an ecology of mind, they're profoundly different. So that if I'm raised in the Judeo-Christian mental space, it takes a great effort and skill, if I'm able, to morph my mind into the Hindu way of seeing reality, or to the classical Chinese way, or into the way of the Lakota Native American vision of reality. To reshape and remorph our mind into a different ecology, a different conceptual space, reveals the world in a profoundly different way. So it's not just a clash of religious worlds, it's a clash of worldviews, whatever they may be. So if it's Genesis or Big Bang, those would be very different worldviews. And so our religious traditions, the irony is that the great founders of our religions saw the global shift to the dialogical way, seeing the self in the other, the way of compassion, the way of the golden rule. But the practitioners of our religion tend to be stuck often in the monocentric lens of seeing reality from this particular ego lens, ego point of view, that universalizes its own truth as the truth for all people. It's not able to make the shift to the dialogical global lens where we can really see the world in open space for multiplicity of alternative views. So ironically, the crisis of our time is to see that religions that in their hearts should teach love and brotherhood and coming together under the divine often are the deepest source of alienation and religious clashes. So we see a difference between religions as practiced in this egocentric, fundamentalist, reductive way, and spirituality, which is precisely transforming and awakening into this space of compassion and care and love. I think Jesus is a great example of that. I think that Jesus is a wonderful example of this shift to the global lens, to the space of compassion, where you see yourself in the other, where you see yourself in the poor person or the hungry or the person in prison. And so when he said, when I was in prison you visited me, and when I was hungry you fed me, when you enter this global lens you begin to have the profoundest compassion because you see yourself in the other. That's a dialogical. So I think if our religions were practicing the script that is at their core in this way, we would not have these religious clashes. What is global spirituality? It is recognizing that there's a wide spectrum of spiritual traditions across the planet through the ages. And if we could begin to open up our horizon and vista to begin to explore these internally, not from the outside, but to see through these different lenses, reality opens up in a profoundly different way. So then if you listen to Lao Tzu, and you hear in the classical Chinese, the Tao that can be named is not the Tao. That powerful formula that opens up Lao Tzu's great text is saying that the holy name, the Tao, the infinite word, cannot be named in the ego language, in the ego way. To name it in the ego way is to violate the name. And that tradition is echoed across different traditions. So in the Hindu version of that, to meditate on Om, the infinite syllable, the infinite symbol of all symbols, which can never be spoken in the ego voice, is the source of all names and all language. So that in the dialogue with Krishna and Arjuna in the classical text, the Bhagavad Gita, you'll find another wonderful role model of a deep dialogue, because Krishna is the voice of Om. Arjuna is the everyday person who has been impaled in this egocentric lens, and therefore is in a war, a division within himself, a division of the family, a fratricidal war, and that is the scene of the Bhagavad Gita. So that as Arjuna drops his weapon when his conscience pierces him on the battlefield, and the higher self begins to open up, and he realizes it's not right to kill my own people, and he drops his weapon and says, Krishna, help me, I don't know what to do. Krishna enters the dialogue where the voice of Om, the higher voice, begins to dialogue with the ego voice to help it move step by step from the ego place of samsara and bondage and suffering and of violence to the place of the integrative compassion and the moral law of Krishna consciousness. So the question, if we look at these other traditions, where can we find exemplars? You know, I mentioned Buddha. Buddha's essential insight was that ego is suffering. It is caused by ego attachment and desire. It can be overcome, and it can be overcome through the right conduct of mind, again the technology. So Buddha was diagnosing that ego mind is the source of suffering, and that the cure, the prescription as a medical prescription, is to transform. We can get out of the ego technology and move into this space of emptiness, the space where all things meet. It's a space of fullness, and we do so through the right practice of the Eightfold Path. So Buddhist ethics is conducting our minds in the higher technology of right judgment, right thinking, right livelihood, right practice, and so forth, which is rehabilitating the mind, literally, from the ego habits, which are vices, to the habits of the Dharma or the moral law. I'm giving examples then, whether it's Lao Tzu or Krishna or Buddha or Jesus or Moses. I think the heart of the Judaic tradition, which starts out, Hear, O Israel, love thy God with all thy heart and might, is asking and requiring us to put God first above the self and the ego needs. So it's calling for a decentering of the ego and a recentering every breath in terms of what is higher. The challenge of our planet at this point in our evolution is the painful shift from the dominance of the ego lens into the place of the global or dialogue lens. And our survival turns on that. And I think that our great teachers and scriptures speaking from the infinite word. And there's no accident that our different traditions and indigenous traditions have all pointed to there being something fundamental and first and infinite. There's a profound pull to that. And in science too, when you say that there is the ultimate energy or the nature, whatever word we use for the unified field, it is pointing to that in scientific terms. So I see science as part of this spiritual journey to tap what is first and develop the tools and technology and language to process this unified field, where we find the compassion, where we find knowledge, where we find democracy, where we find ethics, and the flourishing of human life.